Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, November 2nd, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Senator Lindsey Graham says there is no limit on Israel killing civilians. So Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina said on Tuesday that there should be no limit on how many civilian casualties Israel incurs in its bombardment of Gaza. So Graham made these comments while appearing on CNN after Israel bombed the Jabalia refugee camp in North Gaza, killing dozens of people. An Israeli military commander was asked after the strike if Israel was aware that the camp was full of innocent civilians and did not deny anything, just said, basically, this is the cost of war. This is the tragedy of war. So Graham was asked about this when he was on CNN, and he was asked if there is a threshold where the U.S. might ask Israel to hold off on causing so many civilian casualties. And Graham invoked World War II and said, quote, "No, if somebody asked us after World War II, is there a limit? What would you do to make sure that Japan and Germany didn't conquer the world? Is there any limit what Israel should do to the people who are trying to slaughter the Jews? The answer is no. There is no limit," end quote. So no limit. Doesn't matter that they're killing all these kids and babies. Just doesn't matter to Graham. Clearly does not matter to the Biden administration as well. And Israeli officials have been pointing to the U.S. and allied bombings of Germany and Japan during World War II, as I've been covering, as an example of, killing of civilians in a war. And, hundreds of thousands, if you combined the estimates of German civilians and Japanese civilians killed by, Allied bombing, it gets into the millions. And we don't know the exact numbers. But, this comparison includes dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is what they're talking about. And Lindsey Graham has previously referenced this as well. When the conflict, the current fighting first started after the Hamas attack, Graham said that if Israel did not do something similar to what the U.S. did in World War II, then it would be making a mistake. He said, quote, "Gaza is going to look like Tokyo and Berlin at the end of World War II when this is over. And if it doesn't look that way, Israel made a mistake," end quote. And again, he mentioned Tokyo. And the firebombing of Tokyo was one of the most brutal things that happened in that war. They estimate 100,000 civilians were killed in a single night. And I know this is kind of a common theme of the stories that I've been covering lately, as the top stories is the fact that there's all these people in the U.S. and Israel basically accepting that there's going to be a lot of civilian casualties. There already clearly are a lot of civilian casualties. And I think it's just the reason why I want to keep focusing on this is because this is a war being funded by the U.S. government, being funded by our tax dollars, shipping. The Pentagon said the other day that they're shipping weapons over every day. And Biden wants another $14 billion to keep funding this. And this is what we're funding. What it is a mass slaughter. So according to Gaza's health ministry, the current death toll, this was early on Wednesday, so it might have already gone up. The current child death toll, I just put the child death toll in here, is 3,648. And so you see Lindsey Graham said there's no limits, and I know I've covered this as well, but the Pentagon was asked on Monday about civilian and child casualties, and the Pentagon said there's no limits on the weapons that the U.S. gives to Israel. So, we see Lindsey Graham, and a lot of times I cover the crazy things that he says, and he is one of the most extreme hawks in Congress. He talks about how Putin should be assassinated, they need regime change in Russia. But on this, he's lining up with what the Biden administration is doing, with what the Pentagon is doing in its support for Israel. It's full-throated, it's unconditional, doesn't matter what they do. So the next one here, the UN says that Israeli strikes on the Jabalia refugee camp could amount to war crimes. So the UN's Human Rights Office said this on Wednesday. It wrote on X, quote, "Given the high number of civilian casualties and the scale of destruction following Israeli airstrikes on Jabalia refugee camp, we have serious concerns that these are disproportionate attacks and could amount to war crimes," end quote. So Israel actually struck the Jabalia refugee camp for a second time on Wednesday, and the Israeli military claimed that the strikes that hit the camp killed a guy named Mohammed Assar, who they said is the head of Hamas's anti-tank missile unit, but there's no confirmation of this. And Gaza's health ministry said that scores of people were killed and wounded in the Wednesday airstrikes, but the death toll is not clear. There was another phone and internet outage in Gaza on Wednesday because I was told about this second airstrike on the refugee camp pretty early on Wednesday, and I couldn't really find any information about it. And it turns out it's because there was another phone and internet outage, which must have been cut off by the Israelis who control all this stuff. And the New York Times later reported that they couldn't confirm any sort of death toll. They couldn't get in touch with doctors or hospital officials, in the area because of the outages. And I'm not sure. I think it was just temporary, the outages, or outages in some areas and not others. But, this just goes to show it's another weapon in Israel's arsenal is to be able to cut off the people in Gaza from the outside world. So according to the New York Times, the second strike took place in the Fallujah neighborhood of Jabalia, which is about half a mile south of where Tuesday's attack took place. The paper verified video footage of rescue workers and residents digging through the rubble and carrying what appeared to be injured and dead people out, including children. So more children killed. And we know that the attack on Tuesday killed at least 50 people. So, and again, I put in the quote here, basically the Israeli military spokesman just shrugging off the fact that they dropped, according to officials in Gaza, I don't think this was confirmed by Israel, they said they dropped 6 U.S.-made bombs on this area. So, again, real just brutal stuff. All right, so the next one here, some foreign nationals and severely wounded Palestinians were able to leave Gaza into Egypt. So after weeks of enduring a vicious bombing campaign, some dual nationals and severely wounded Palestinians were allowed to leave Gaza through the Rafah border crossing into Egypt. So an Egyptian official told CNN that 361 foreign passport holders and 81 severely wounded Palestinians entered Egypt through the Rafah crossing on Wednesday. Apparently there was more wounded that were going to be able to leave, but they died on their way to the crossing. So the official said that among the foreign nationals are citizens of Austria, the United Kingdom, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Italy, and Japan. So the State Department has estimated that there's 400 American citizens trapped in Gaza, but it's not clear how many got out on Wednesday. The White House said that they expected a handful of Americans to be among the people who were able to get out. The State Department later confirmed that some Americans got out, but they didn't say how many. According to CNN, 2 American physicians entered Egypt from Gaza. So if you remember, Antony Blinken and his State Department recently blamed everything on Hamas. They were asked about the hundreds of Americans that are trapped in Gaza that can't get out, and Blinken said basically the only thing that's keeping them in is Hamas, which is just ridiculous because Gaza's under an Israeli military blockade and a partial Egyptian blockade as well because they control that one border crossing. And all the reports, media outlets talking to these dual nationals said they were told to go to the border crossing area and they weren't let into Egypt. They didn't say anything about Hamas stopping them or anything like that. So sources told CNN that there was a diplomatic agreement worked out between Israel, Egypt, and Hamas to allow this to happen. So at least there's some sort of negotiations going on, and this is all being mediated by, or at least I believe it's being mediated by Qatar. They make the most sense to be the mediators. And ABC News actually had a report, and they spoke with an American who was stuck in Gaza at the border crossing with his family for days, for weeks now at this point, unless he did get out. But they said that the State Department told him that it wasn't just Hamas keeping, holding everything up. In a message, a senior State Department official told him, quote, "There's more than one sticking point. We need Egypt, Israel, and the DFA to all agree," end quote. And DFA is an abbreviation for the de facto authorities in Gaza. So, we hear a lot about the hostages. There are some American hostages, but, Israeli-American hostages, but we don't hear about the we don't hear much, at least, about the hundreds of Americans that are stuck in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Biden's conspiracy theory about Gaza casualty numbers unravels. So this is an article from The Intercept, and they took a look at the Ministry of Health list that was released about the casualties. So when Biden accused the Palestinians of lying about the death toll, Gaza's health ministry published at the time just under 7,000 names of Palestinians who were killed. So President Joe Biden asked last week what his government planned to do to reduce the number of civilian casualties in Gaza, responded by rejecting the idea that the numbers could be trusted. He said, quote, "I have no notion if Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. I'm sure innocents have been killed, and that is the price of waging war, but I have no confidence in the number that Palestinians are using," end quote. So a new analysis by The Intercept provides evidence refuting that claim. Biden's efforts to delegitimize the numbers coming out of Gaza as fake news has created an opening for defenders of Israel's indiscriminate bombing campaign to dismiss the crisis. They note that Hamas governs Gaza and therefore runs the Ministry of Health and is inflating the figures. So Biden's claim was quickly rejected by human rights organizations that have been active in Gaza for years. Again, as I've covered, they've said that the health ministry is considered reliable, and the numbers generally match what the Israeli government and the United Nations has come up with for previous conflicts. And they say the Gazan health ministry released those names. And they said that the only mistake that they found was that one name of a 14-year-old boy was listed twice. Now that the health ministry has published a list of victims, skeptics have suggested that the list may be fabricated and that a paper with names on it proves nothing. So John Kirby, expressed skepticism about it. So basically what The Intercept does here is that they speak with a Palestinian who was born and raised in Gaza and now lives in Florida. So an American has told The Intercept about the deaths of 7 relatives on his father's side of the family and 30 on his mother's side in and around Khan Yunis. A week later, that number had risen to 46, a total of 46. So that's how many of his relatives have been killed. And they compared the list of his relatives that began to be compiled last week to the list subsequently made by the Ministry of Health and his parents. So they didn't publish the names, but basically the list of those killed includes 4 different last names, 30 members of one branch of the family. So anyway, sorry, there's a lot of details here. The important point here is that of the 46 members of this guy's family that were killed, 43 appear on the list, from the littlest, a baby girl, not yet 1 year old, to the oldest, a 71-year-old grandmother. So basically what they found is that, if anything, the list is less. It shows there's actually more people that have been killed than were listed by Gaza's health ministry at the time. All right. So the next one here, Israel says that 16 of its soldiers have been killed in the ground invasion so far. So the Israeli military said this on Wednesday, that 16 Israeli soldiers have been killed fighting in Gaza since they launched the invasion of the besieged enclave. Clashes were reported in several parts of the northern Gaza Strip on Wednesday as the Israeli military claimed that it broke through Hamas's first line of defenses in the area. So if you could see this map here, I'm happy. This is from South Front, And I'm happy that they put out a map of the fighting, because they let us use their stuff, and this one is pretty good. And it shows the different areas. So if you see highlighted in red is not controlled by Israel, and highlighted in purple is the Israeli positions. So they're pushing in from basically three different directions: from the north, from the sea, from the west. Looks like they came in from the beach, and then in the east, further south a little bit. But it's all around Gaza City, where it says Gaza on this map. That is Gaza City. So this is just the northern portion of Gaza. So it definitely seems like there's significant fighting going on the ground. And an Israeli military spokesman said, quote, "The ground operation is progressing as planned. With advanced planning, precise intelligence, and joint attacks from land, sea, and air, our forces broke through Hamas's front line of defense in the north of the Gaza Strip." So for their part, Hamas is saying that their fighters are inflicting heavy casualties, and claiming that the Israeli death toll is actually higher than what Israel is reporting. And according to the Palestine Chronicle, Al-Qassam Brigade, which is the armed wing of Hamas, said that it has been able to take out many Israeli armored vehicles. They put out some videos that are said to be their fighters taking out Israeli tanks or armored vehicles, and they look pretty real to me. I don't know. But Israeli airstrikes continued to hit Gaza on Wednesday throughout the besieged enclave. And so the death toll, I mentioned the child death toll, but the total death toll that the Gaza's health ministry is putting out right now is 8,805. So getting close to 9,000. All right. So the next one here, countries downgrade their ties with Israel over the Gaza bombing. So this is from the Libertarian Institute by Kyle Anzalone. So a trio of South American countries, along with Jordan, have downgraded ties with Israel over the onslaught in Gaza. According to Palestinian sources, the Israeli military operations in Gaza have killed nearly 9,000 people. On Tuesday, Bolivia took the most extreme step and cut all ties with Israel. So that's pretty significant to see Bolivia do that. And they said that the decision that Bolivia, quote, decided to break diplomatic relations with the Israeli state in repudiation and condemnation of the aggressive and disproportionate Israeli military offensive taking place in the Gaza Strip, end quote. Israel accused them of capitulating to terrorism, of course. Colombia and Chile announced that they would recall their ambassadors from Israel. So not quite severing ties, but withdrawing their ambassadors, which is a significant diplomatic move. And Jordan also joined the South American nations in downgrading ties with Israel. The foreign ministry announced that it was recalling its ambassador. So I think it's significant to see three countries in Latin America, doing this. These aren't Arab countries. These are, countries on the other side of the world that are taking steps to reduce relations with Israel over what they're doing in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Gaza's only cancer treatment hospital shuts down because they ran out of fuel. So Palestinian health authorities have said that the only hospital offering cancer treatment in the Gaza Strip has gone out of service after it ran out of fuel amid Israel's continuing blockade of the territory. The Israeli siege on Gaza has cut off supplies of fuel and heavily restricted access to food, water, and electricity, while the Israeli military continues to bombard the Strip, where hospitals are filled with the dying and wounded, and shortages have put huge pressure on medical workers. In a press conference on Wednesday, Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital Director Subi Sukaik said that the facility was no longer functioning. Palestinian authorities, they repeat the death toll. This is an article from Al Jazeera, by the way. I did not mention that. But the suspension of operations at this hospital means that 16 of the Gaza Strip's 35 hospitals are now out of service, as are more than 50 of Gaza's 72 primary healthcare clinics. So again, just a really dire situation. And we see these aid trucks going in, but Israel's not letting fuel in. And the hospitals need fuel to power their generators. Fuel's needed to deliver food, of course, and things like that. All right, so the next one here, hundreds of Palestinians displaced in the West Bank. So this article is from The Cradle, and things are getting real bad over in the West Bank, since all this violence broke out. Over 800 people from at least 98 households in the occupied West Bank have been displaced by Israeli settlers since the start of last month, according to a report released on November 1st by the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The report reads, quote, in 15 hurting communities across the West Bank, at least 98 households, comprising 828 people, including 313 children, have been displaced amid settler violence or increased movement restrictions since October 7th, end quote. Just days ago, 141 Palestinians from a southern West Bank town fled their homes after armed settlers threatened to kill them if they refused to leave. So this is something that a lot of people, not too familiar with the situation in the West Bank really understand, is that, the displacement of Palestinians didn't just happen in 1948. It's been continuing in the West Bank slowly, but, these settlers, these fanatical settlers in the West Bank want the land that these Palestinians live on, and they'll do anything to drive them out, and they are backed by the military. Sometimes you'll see the Israeli government kind of crack down on them, but usually they're able to do it whatever they want, and they have the protection of the IDF. So, of course, they're taking the opportunity of all the tensions to really start pushing more Palestinians out of their homes. This is a lot of people kicked out of their homes, and, I'm sure most of them are not going to be able to go back. And they mentioned, which something I covered was the Middle East Eye report that said settlers distributed flyers across the West Bank threatening Palestinians to flee to Jordan. Their flyers said, quote, this is your last chance to run to Jordan before we kill our enemies and expel you from our holy land promised to us by God, end quote. So that's what we're supporting with $3.8 billion in military aid each year, and now they're going to get a nice extra $14 billion at some point once Congress passes it. All right, so the next one here, Ukraine to push U.S. for more weapons and training. So this is another article from Kyle, and it is about Ukraine's continued lobbying efforts. So Ukraine and some European countries are ramping up a lobbying push in the U.S. to get Americans to back more aid to Kiev. Ukrainian officials are seeking new long-range rockets and accelerated training programs. The propaganda push comes after a Time magazine article portrayed Kiev in disarray and as a hotbed for corruption. So according to Politico, quote, Ukrainian officials and allies in Europe are ramping up their lobbying campaign in the U.S. for new weapons and training, end quote. The authors cite a recent Ukrainian delegation that toured America with a wish list that included they want U.S. Marine Corps training on conducting ship-to-shore operations, new air defenses to take down the Russian glide bombs that are devastating Ukrainian forces, and the long-range single-warhead version of the Army Tactical Missile System, that's the ATACMS. And the Biden administration secretly shipped ATACMS to Ukraine last month, but they gave them the cluster bomb version that has a shorter range than the single warhead, but still it has a pretty decent range, and it gives Ukraine the ability to fire cluster bombs very far, which is just insane. So the representatives of the Ukrainian government are attempting to adapt their message to the current American political landscape. You have a former Ukrainian Marine who is lobbying, is comparing Russians to Hamas. They're trying to tie it all together like Blinken did the other day. We got to keep funding Israel's war. We got to keep funding the war in Ukraine because, they're facing evil like Russia, Hamas, and China's watching. They just want to put all this stuff together. All right, so the next one here, China and Japan face off near disputed islands in the East China Sea. So Chinese and Japanese Coast Guard vessels faced off near the disputed Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea on Monday. So you might be wondering why I'm covering this obscure maritime dispute between China and Japan. And it's because, much like the disputes in the South China Sea, the U.S. has actually pledged to go to war over these islands. So the Senkaku Islands, known as the I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, Diaoyu Islands in China. That's what they call them in China, Diaoyu Islands. They are uninhabited and controlled by Japan, but also claimed by China and Taiwan. The islands are a long-standing point of friction between Beijing and Tokyo, and confrontations in the area are common. Japan stakes their claim on these islands back when Imperial Japan took them in 1895. China goes back to one of their old dynasties. That's their claim. If you look at the map, it is closer to, Taiwan and China than Japan. What you would consider the main Japanese islands, not the Ryukyu Islands, which, again, were conquered by the Imperial Japanese in the 1800s. Anyway, according to the Japanese Coast Guard, in this incident that happened on Monday, its patrol boats repeatedly urged 3 Chinese vessels to leave the area. The Chinese side said that 3 Japanese ships and several patrol ships entered the territorial waters of the islands illegally. They told them to go away. So it's, these things happen a lot. According to the South China Morning Post, a similar incident took place about 3 weeks ago. And during that encounter, Japan's Coast Guard said that it maneuvered to prevent Chinese vessels from approaching Japanese fishing boats. So again, these islands are controlled by Japan, but China's Coast Guard has had a presence there a lot, in recent years, and it angers Japan. And sometimes they get close to each other, and these things happen. So the U.S. has for years, really, I know Obama did it, made this pledge that they would defend the Senkaku Islands, saying that the mutual defense portion of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty applies to these islands, which means that this dispute in the East China Sea is another potential flashpoint for a war between the U.S. and China. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin reaffirmed the pledge on October 4th when his Japanese counterpart was visiting Washington. He said, quote, "Now we face major shared challenges, including China's coercive behavior and North Korea's dangerous provocations and Russia's reckless war of choice against Ukraine. But America's Article 5 treaty commitment to the defense of Japan remains ironclad, and it covers all territories under Japan's administration, including the Senkaku Islands," end quote. And probably the only reason he didn't mention Hamas there was that he made that statement before the October 7th attack. So again, it's just another area. And I know it's been a long-running dispute, but one thing, in 2012, Japan nationalized the Senkaku Islands. Before that, they were privately owned. And then the Japanese government bought them and nationalized them, and that really angered China. All right, so that's everything for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Daniel Larison. DeSantis' foreign policy speech was a real dud. One from Dan Steinbach, the rise of Jewish settlements and apartheid policies. One from Jonathan Grotenfent, U.S. entangling alliances are dizzying, disorienting, and leading to disaster. It's a good summary of all the alliances that the U.S. has gotten itself involved in since, around the 1980s, and turning on people, backing Saddam against Iran, turning around and, making Saddam the enemy, things like that. One from Lori Calhoun, depleted citizenry, democracy. And our spotlight is from David Sachs. He's writing at Responsible Statecraft. Time magazine may be on Zelensky's side, but real time is not. But that is everything for me. You could always help us out by sharing the show, liking, subscribing on YouTube. I know there's been a lot of people commenting lately, and I really appreciate it, the engagement and all the feedback and stuff. Again, I really do appreciate it, and everyone that listens and watches and reads the articles that I write for antiwar.com. Also follow us on Twitter. I am at DeCampDave. You could follow antiwar.com at antiwarcom. But that's everything. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.